it also evades communication, even if and when it operates inside a communication relational intersubjective field. So I would like to make it clear that to say transsubjectivity, to say matrixial transsubjectivity, it means looking together at quite a number of coordinations that allow the idea of transsubjectivity, and this is not intersubjective, and it does not depend on us being in communication. This sphere, this apprehension is working even if we don't communicate about it and we don't compose field of communication. Subjectivity here is a transgressive encounter between I call I, and not self, not ego, of course, the partial subject, encounter between I and uncognized, yet intimate, non-I. And the definition of the non-I is again a partial subject or a partial object. There is all the time the encounter between I and non-I, and put it in the several, in the plural, I, S, and non-Is, encountering on a level which is subsubjective, that is not on the level of our self-identity, which is usually quite defensive and worrying about its own boundaries. On another level, there is this encounter all the time between the non-I and the I, which are intimately related, but not cognizing one another, not necessarily cognizing one another, not to begin with in any case. So cognition might take place, might not take place, but is not a condition for that transmissivity to happen, to act, and to transform us together. In this field, I'm talking about co-poietic transformational potentiality. Poiesis, as you maybe know, poietic, is a term of Francisco Varela. He's talking about emergence and poiesis, and his subject or subjectivity function inside closed systems, because Francisco Varela worked in biology and then artificial intelligence. He was very influential on me and some of my friends. He influenced a lot their thinking of Guattari, for example. But then he talks about poiesis, the way that a system creates its own history ontologically, continually from its own memory, evolving and so on, but this is in a closed space, closed organism. And I assume right from the beginning, copoiesis, processes of transformation, potentiality which is transformational, and poietic and creative, working in webs of transconnectivity between individual on the transgressive level. And this copoietic transformational potentiality evolves both on unconscious path, which could be called aesthetic unconscious path, but also on what we might call the ethical field or ethical unconscious path. In my very recent essays, I work a lot on the ethics in terms of the matrixial sphere, what would be responsibility in the sense of the matrixial, what would be compassion, what would be care, what would be abandonment or cruelty, and it has again its own parameters. And in order to I mostly do not employ the words object, though this is where psychoanalysis comes from. We talk about the other as my object. Our objects of desire could be things and could be people and could be the others and so on. And we are using this, of course, a language of subject and objects, because there is a borderline between objects and subjects and between subjects, and then to cross the borderlines is a whole of a movement we have to do. We have other kind of problems and problematics when we assume a phase in which transsubjectivity is from the beginning functioning, because there we need to find out how would processes of differentiating occur, how would difference manifest itself, what would mean feminine difference or masculine difference, and it's not the field of gender, but it is surely a field of sexual difference. We might enter into that soon. And so I don't usually use the language of objects. The other is not an object present or objet a, object little a, as absent in the Lacanian terminology, if you want, but rather the language of links. What is lost or what is looked after is not an object, but a certain type of linking to the other. And therefore I use language of border linking, border spacing, and rather than talking about accumulations of affects into object, it is more useful to talk about strings and threads. Because you should imagine that whenever an event, a psychic event, happens in the non-I, for example, in my non-I, then we can imagine whatever goes on the phantasmatic level, or even in a traumatic way, as in the border linking between us, between the I and the non-I. And therefore we can imagine, we can use imaginatively the language of strings or of threads, and imagine that when you touch here, something happens here as well. And when you touch here, something happens here. And so this language is very useful to describe all kind of information, mental information, affective influence that is not, doesn't reach the fixity of an object, of a mental object. That would be too fixed for the matrixial sphere. So of course we are talking about the production of particular kind of knowledge. We'll try to talk about that later. Unconscious transmission and reattunement, as well as resonant copoietic knowledge, do not depend on verbal communication, on intentional organization, or on intersubjective relationship. And therefore we can start to imagine aesthetical and ethical processes which are impregnated by what I call matrixial copoiesis. In aesthetical working through, which is the work of the artist transforms time and space of an encounter event into what we might call matrixial screen and gaze. I adopt here the language of Lacan when I talk about the screen and the gaze. The gaze in Lacan terminology is not necessarily what we see. It's never what we see. It is the way we are desiring to be looked at by the other. Desiring but always missing this opportunity to be looked at the way we want, right? So this is the gaze in Lacan. And the screen is always the screen of fantasy, where this negotiation goes on. I solicitate a certain gaze, I never receive it, and so on again, from disappointment to disappointment. And this goes very well with the Lacanian attitude, where we are all the time dealing with the object of desire